So before we begin our study of photosynthesis and we get into all the chemical reactions and the enzymes and the metabolic pathways, I want to make sure you understand a little bit of background about the nature of light and pigments. So understand photosynthesis is about energy. All living things need energy in order to function and carry out their life process. What we're going to be talking about here are autotrophs. Autotrophs are those organisms that can capture the energy from sunlight, and then they're going to use it to make carbohydrates, glucose to start with, and then eventually building up to starches and other things. In plants, which is mainly what we'll talk about, this takes place inside the chloroplast of the cell on these structures called thylakoids. These are found mainly in the leaves and in some of the green stems, not the woody stems, but the green stems of plants. This also occurs in algae, which are not plants, they're protists. So algae cells have these chloroplasts and plants do as well. So this is a micrograph, a picture of some plant cells, and you can see here they are jam-packed full of these green blobs, which are all chloroplasts. Here's a little bit about the leaf anatomy of a plant. So if we were to take a little small section of this leaf, you can see that it's made up of layers. We have the cuticle, which is a waxy layer that protects from water loss. And then there's a layer of epidermal cells, and then a layer of some cells that are called mesophyll cells. There are palisade and spongy mesophyll cells. It's in these mesophyll cells where most of the photosynthesis will take place. That's where most of the chloroplasts will be found, although there are chloroplasts in the epidermis as well. And then running down the center of the leaf are the vascular system of xylem and phloem cells. We'll talk more about this in the spring, but understand that this is where most of these processes we're going to talk about take place. Here's a close-up image of a chloroplast. I just wanted to point out, of course, you learned something about the endosymbiotic theory earlier in the year. And so these, we believe these were once free-living organisms before they became organelles. They do have a double membrane system, so there's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And then within the chloroplast itself are stacks of membranous material called thylakoids. I kind of like to say they look like pancakes. They're little stacks of things. And they are bathed in and surrounded by fluid called the stroma. So that's where photosynthesis is taking place. Now let's talk a little bit about the nature of light. Photosynthesis itself is going to be using the energy from sunlight. Another word for sunlight, another term for it, is electromagnetic radiation, which takes a variety of different forms. The one that plants use are it's in the range that we call visible light. Now, light itself behaves sometimes like a particle. We call it a photon, and it sometimes behaves like a wave. So when we talk about light, we talk about properties of waves, other kinds of waves. Different colors of light have different wavelengths. So we can actually measure the wavelength of a wave of light and the different wavelengths we perceive as different colors. They also have different amounts of energy. So different colors of light actually have different amounts of energy. Wavelengths of light are measured in these units called nanometers, which is a billionth of a meter, very small. The visible range that plants use and that we can see ranges from 400 nanometers up to 700 nanometers, give or take. So here's a diagram of part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And what we're talking about here is just this visible range. It goes from about 400 to about 700 nanometers. Beyond the 400 nanometer range, even smaller than that, we enter what's called the ultraviolet range. Above that, or in longer wavelengths, we enter what's called infrared. So it's this narrow band between 400 and 700 that we can see as visible light. And the wavelengths vary like this, violet, blue, etc., up to red. Notice it kind of looks like a rainbow. So that whole rainbow of colors, Roy G. Biv, you've probably heard of before, is the range of different wavelengths and different energies of visible light. Now, when we look at light coming from the sun, it contains all of those wavelengths, all of those energies. We see it as white light, and so white light contains all of the wavelengths and all of the energies of light. The colors we see in objects is because of the light that is reflected off of the object to our eye. So a green plant is green because it mainly reflects green light, which means it's absorbing the other wavelengths, the other colors. It's absorbing the reds, the violets, the yellows, the oranges, but reflecting the green. And that's why we see it as green. Now, we see plants as green because of these molecules within the chloroplast called pigments. Pigments are molecules that are colorful in various ways. Paints have pigments in them. And they're colorful because they absorb some wavelengths and they reflect others. And remember, what they reflect is what we see as that color. So they're going to absorb some and reflect or transmit others. Chlorophyll is the name of the pigment that is the predominant pigment in plants. There are actually two kinds of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And chlorophyll A is the main one. It absorbs all wavelengths except in the yellow-green range, which it reflects. So the yellow-green color is the pigment that is most predominant in plants. That's why most plants appear green. Here's the structure of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Notice they're very similar. Also notice it's kind of a complex ring structure with a long chain hydrocarbon on the end. And also notice that it's anchored here by magnesium and nitrogen. And this is why, of course, plants need magnesium and nitrogen. We call it, nutrients for plants. They need that to build their chlorophyll. Without chlorophyll, of course, they cannot perform photosynthesis and they will die. Now, plants have other pigments, and these pigments are called accessory pigments, and they're what give plants other kinds of colors that we see, for instance, in fruits or in flowers. Here are some examples. Beta-carotene you may have heard of. It's an orange pigment. Lycopene is red. We see that in tomatoes. Lutein is a yellow pigment that's in, for instance, these marigolds. And then there are a range of different pigments called anthocyanins, which are blues, purples, and reds. These accessory pigments help attract animals to eat the fruit and the seeds and scatter the seeds, or attract them to the flowers for pollination. So they usually are used by the plant to attract animals. So I just wanted to show you this absorbance spectrum. These are some different pigments that are found in plants. And what this shows you is the relative absorption at different wavelengths. So we have 400 nanometers here, 700 here, and you can see for chlorophyll A and B, they absorb a lot in the low wavelengths and a lot in the high wavelengths, and not much here in the middle, which is where you'll see the greens, the green light. And then you can also see here lycopene. This is zeaxanthin, I didn't talk about that one, beta-carotene and lutein. So these are some of the ones I just talked about, and you can see that they absorb a lot in the purples and not at all in the orange and reds, and that gives them their color. Whatever they're not absorbing, they're reflecting those colors. Last but not least, I wanted to say a little bit about why leaves change color in the fall. Not so much in Florida, but elsewhere, the leaves of many trees and shrubs do change color in the fall. What happens is that the chlorophyll, of course, in the spring and summer predominate the colors of leaves because, of course, they're actively photosynthesizing during those months. As the daylight changes in the fall, the amount of daylight as the days grow shorter, that's a signal to the plant to enter dormancy. At that time, they stop making chlorophylls, and at a slower rate, they stop making the accessory pigments. But what you'll see then when the greens disappear is that these brilliant colors, the oranges, the purples, the reds, the yellows, begin to show as a result. Ultimately, the plant will stop making the accessory pigments as well, and then you'll see the leaves turn brown and fall off. But that's why leaves change color in the fall. And that's it about light and pigments.